Welcome back to the heat. Tunisia's parliament recently passed an anti-terrorism law after gunmen with ties to Islamic State carried out two devastating attacks in the past 5 months. In March, gunmen stormed the National Museum in Tunis, killing 22 people. Then in June, another gunman attacked a resort in Sousse, killing 38 tourists. Since then, the government has mobilized additional military and police to guard hotels and museums. The United Nations estimates some 5,500 Tunisians have joined Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Now Tunisia is building a 160-kilometer-long wall along its border with Libya in an effort to stop Islamic terrorists from entering the country. Joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio is Alberto Fernandez. He's the Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute and a U.S. diplomat. Ambassador, thanks for joining us. Looking at Tunisia, at one time it was the poster child for what became known as the Arab Spring. It embraced democracy. The transition to democracy was swift, relatively pain-free. How and why did it become a target for ISIL?
Well, it's for those very reasons that it's a target for ISIL. The idea that the danger that Tunisia could become some alternate model to the two reigning models that we see in the Middle East, the kind of Salafi jihadist, violent model of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and the traditional model of authoritarian Arab states. So the idea that Tunisia is possibly this liberal, democratic, open state, open society, is actually a threat for ISIS and for Al-Qaeda. That's the reason that they're attracted to it.
And looking at the threat that ISIL poses to a country like Tunisia, we have neighboring Libya, which is in chaos. It has been in chaos ever since the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi. Has Libya, in effect, become a sanctuary now for ISIL?
Oh, definitely. ISIL is looking for ungoverned spaces. It's looking for room to grow. Places like Libya, places like the West Africa province of ISIS, which is formerly Boko Haram, they look for these spaces to expand, especially as the space that they have in their homeland, their so-called center in Syria and Iraq contracts and comes under greater pressure. They're going to look for opportunities to expand in other areas, whether that be in South Yemen or in North Africa.
And we look at the emergence of ISIL. To what extent did the NATO bombing of Libya that led to destabilization in that country contribute to the country being ungovernable right now? There's different factions ruling different parts of the country, giving ISIL a place where it could grow.
Well, the problem is not so much the military operation. The problem is, and you can make the same case in Iraq or in Syria, the problem is what replaces a military operation. In other words, you can create a vacuum by military action. You can promote the change of a dictatorial regime like the Gaddafi regime into something else. But then you better make sure that that something else is better and that it emerges. So I think the great criticism that can be made of the West is not what it did in Libya, but that it walked away afterwards.
Well, Tunisia has responded by extending the state of emergency. It's deploying more military, more police right now. Is that going to be sufficient?
It faces the challenge that all states do, all real states, democratic or otherwise, face, which is how do you conserve those values which are most important in society, especially a democratic country like Tunisia, values of openness and tolerance and pluralism, freedom of speech, with a security threat. It's a problem that every country has had in the world. The United States faced it after 9/11. Western European countries have faced it as a result of different terrorist groups. They're living it right now, and so it's always a challenge. It's always a balance. How do you accomplish what you want to do against the adversary without losing your soul?
Yeah, because those anti-terrorism laws that I talked about just a moment ago, they were passed overwhelmingly by the Tunisian parliament. Critics are saying these laws can be used to prosecute political dissent, and in a sense, Human Rights Watch as well said, look, political dissidents face dangers here. In a sense, are the terrorists winning this war by forcing democratic governments, like the Tunisian government, to impose repressive measures?
It can be if it goes too far. I mean, so far the rules are going to be implemented. There's a possibility of course, of overreach. That hasn't happened yet. There is political space. There is space for dissent in Tunisia today. The danger that the greater the violence becomes, the greater the terrorism becomes, the more this democratically elected government, this government that we support, will need to tighten things. It's a risk that exists, but I don't want to exaggerate it. I mean, the possibility of abuse under these laws exists, but this is a government that does allow quite a range of political views, a lot more than its neighbors.
Looking more broadly at the threat that ISIL poses in the Middle East, what do you make of the United States response to that?
Well, the United States response has been slow and late in that ISIS has been around for a long time. It was on the ropes in 2010. It gained a second wind because of events in Iraq, basically the implosion of the Maliki government, the corruption, the dysfunction of its governance gave the Islamic State of Iraq at that time a second wind. And then that was coupled by the anarchy and the ungoverned space, the opportunity of Syria. So they have been able to respond to a reality on the ground that has allowed them to reinvent themselves and reinvigorate themselves. They're under a lot more pressure now from the United States and from the coalition, but many of us would say that we should never reach this stage. The idea that people were caught unawares by the fall of Mosul, the fall of a third of Iraq into the hands of ISIS, only a little more than a year ago is a condemnation, I think, of the Iraq watchers, of the people who are watching that space.
But is the U.S. policy a little bit ambivalent here? You know, there's no clear-cut policy on what the United States is doing there. Is it fighting a war? Is it not fighting a war? Is it being part of a coalition?
Well, you know, one of the things that the Americans are trying to do is to avoid the problems or the mistakes of the past. Right. And certainly the ISIS threat is a new thing. It's multifaceted. It's complicated. Most of the violence today in Syria, for example, most of the killing in Syria today is not by ISIS. It's by the Assad regime. And yet we're focusing on ISIS. You know, in Iraq, you have the challenge of militias and groups loosely connected to the government as well, committing their own human rights abuses. The big challenge for the Americans and for the coalition is not so much ISIS per se, is if tomorrow, as we hope to see, we destroy ISIS, the question is, what replaces it? What kind of governance, what kind of polity can be created that satisfies, to a certain extent, the aspirations and the worldview of millions of Sunni Arab Muslims living in that part of Syria and Iraq?
Right, talking about the aspirations of Muslims, especially young Muslims, what is the attraction, you know, when they join groups like ISIL? Well,
there are two things. Of course, there's ISIL, the reality on the ground in the Middle East, and then there's the virtual ISIL, which is another thing in a way. The attraction there is complex. First of all, the attraction of Syria, of going to fight in Syria, 2012, 2013, 2014, was the draw. The Muslims are being slaughtered. That's what drew a lot of people to go to Syria. That changed last year when it went from being about defending the Muslims of Syria to creating the perfect Muslim state, the caliphate, the paradise on earth, the perfect Islamic state where you can be authentically Muslim. That is an attraction to people in the West, sometimes naive people, sometimes converts, zealots, who are, especially as young people, tend to idealize violence, tend to idealize thinking that things are easy. Things are not that easy in the world.
If you were back at the State Department right now, if you had the ear of the president or the security establishment at the White House, what would you be saying to them right now?
On which part of this?
On fighting ISIL.
Well, I would say you need to continue what you're doing. Better late than never. My biggest criticism of the administration is not what they're doing today. It's what they failed to do in the years between 2011 and 2014. You need to do more. You need to focus on the solution for a post-ISIS world in the region, which is the key are Sunni Arab Muslims, the tribal elements, the Sunni Arab Muslims of Iraq and Syria.
That's the hard part.
Yes.
Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.